I escaped my family's enabling and my sister's tragic alcoholic decline. The truth I spoke now ensures my past relentlessly pursues me even in Berlin. The notifications sound different in Berlin. That's the first thing I noticed. Back home, the constant buzz of my phone was just noise, part of the background chaos of my life. But here in my quiet apartment overlooking a cobblestone courtyard, each ping and whistle feels like an echo from a world I tried to leave behind. It's been 7 days since I set my life on fire and walked away. 7 days since I told the world the truth, and my phone hasn't stopped screaming since. My name is Christopher Thomas. I'm 26 years old and I work as a UX/UI designer. 3 months ago, I packed 2 suitcases, finalized my visa, and moved halfway across the world to escape my family. I thought an ocean would be enough. I was wrong. The digital world, it turns out, has a very long reach. My new life is simple, structured. I design user interfaces that are meant to be intuitive and clean. There's a logic to it, a clear path from problem to solution. My family was the opposite. For the last 8 years, our family has been a tangled mess of denial, manipulation, and slow-motion tragedy, all centered around my sister Haley. It started when I was 18. Haley was 20, and she had just been treated for alcohol abuse for the first time. I remember the hushed phone calls, the family meetings where the word problem was whispered but never defined. My parents, desperate to maintain the illusion of our perfect, tight-knit family, chose a path of enabling. They became the architects of her destruction, brick by loving brick. If Haley got a DUI, my father paid the lawyer and told everyone she'd just been irresponsible. If she lost a job because she showed up drunk, my mother would say the boss was unfair and slip her a few $100s. They didn't fight the fire. They handed her the gasoline and a book of matches, telling her she was just cold. I watched the vibrant, funny girl I'd grown up with slowly disappear into a fog of vodka and excuses. I was the lone voice of dissent, the one who kept saying, "This isn't normal. She needs real help." But in our family's twisted narrative, I wasn't the concerned brother. I was the judgmental one, the one who didn't understand. 6 months ago, the bill for those 8 years came due. Haley, now 28, was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease. The official term was alcoholic nephropathy. In plain English, her kidneys were failing, a direct consequence of her drinking. The doctors were blunt: dialysis could keep her alive for a while, but the only long-term solution was a transplant. That's when the family's focus, their entire universe of desperate hope, shifted directly onto me. A month after her diagnosis, we got the news. I was a viable and even a strong, compatible donor match. I should have felt something: relief, maybe dread. Instead, I just felt cold, like a resource that had just been discovered. My parents didn't see this as a long shot. They saw it as the obvious solution. My body was no longer my own. It was a spare parts depot for the family crisis. The pressure campaign began almost immediately. It wasn't a single conversation. It was a war of attrition. My mother would call me crying, talking about how I was Haley's only hope. My father would sit me down for serious talks using phrases like family duty and the ultimate sacrifice. They started framing my kidney not as a part of my body, but as a family resource and asset to be deployed for the greater good. They never once, in all those weeks of relentless pressure, addressed the root cause. They talked about Haley's illness as if it were a meteor that had fallen from the sky. They never used the word alcoholism. They never acknowledged that they were asking me to give a vital organ to a person who was still actively drinking, a person who had shown no commitment to changing the very behavior that had destroyed her original kidneys. 4 months ago, I called a final meeting. I couldn't live with the constant barrage anymore. We sat in my parents' living room, the same room where we'd had countless tense Christmases. I looked at my parents and I looked at Haley, who was pale and tired, but still had that flicker of defiance in her eyes. I told them no. Calmly, I explained my right to bodily autonomy. I said that I loved Haley, but I would not sacrifice my own long-term health for a transplant that was likely to fail because she hadn't addressed her addiction. Putting a new kidney into an unchanged lifestyle was like putting a new engine in a car that had no brakes. It wasn't a solution, it was just a more expensive crash waiting to happen. The reaction was biblical. The carefully constructed family narrative shattered. My mother accused me of having a heart of stone. My father told me I was selfishly condemning my sister to death. Haley just stared at me with pure, undiluted hatred. In that moment, I was no longer a son or a brother. I was a traitor. They didn't see my refusal as a decision. They saw it as a declaration of war. A month after that, I was on a plane to Berlin. I'd arranged a transfer through my company, changed my number, and cut all ties. I needed to build a fortress, and an ocean seemed like a good enough moat. For a few months it worked. The silence was beautiful. I explored my new city, made new friends, and for the first time in nearly a decade I could breathe. I could just be Christopher the designer, not Christopher the walking organ bank. Then 1 week ago, they breached the walls. An email appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simply "Your family." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. It was from my parents. Not an olive branch, not an apology, but the final manipulative escalation. It was a long, rambling tirade about my selfishness and my betrayal, but it was the last line that broke me. "You are nothing but an ungrateful child abandoning his family in its time of need. We hope you're happy in your new life all alone." Abandoning them, I didn't abandon them. I escaped. Something inside me snapped. For 8 years, they had controlled the story, painting me as the cold, unfeeling one. They had twisted reality to fit their narrative of a perfect family struck by tragedy. I realized then that an ocean would never be enough. As long as they controlled the narrative, they would never let me go. So I took it from them. I sat down at my laptop and wrote everything. The 8 years of enabling, the DUI and the lost jobs, the pressure campaign, them calling my kidney a family resource. I laid out the facts calmly and chronologically. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for my own sanity. It was a flare shot into the darkness, a final declaration of my truth. I posted it on a public forum, hit send, and shut my laptop. For the first 24 hours, there was silence. Then the storm hit. My story went viral. The validation was overwhelming, thousands of messages from people who had lived through similar situations. People who understood that my decision wasn't about a lack of love, but an act of self-preservation. For the first time, I felt seen. I felt sane. But now, 7 days later, that initial wave of validation has receded, leaving behind a cold, churning anxiety. I seized control of the family narrative, yes, but I did it by making a deeply private disaster public. I feel like I've won a war by detonating a bomb in my own backyard. The support from strangers is a comfort, but it's distant. The reality is that I'm here in Berlin watching the digital shrapnel fly, and I have no idea what comes next. I just won control of the story, but I have a sinking feeling the fight is far from over. The silence in my Berlin apartment had become my sanctuary. For 7 days, it was a shield against the digital hurricane I had unleashed. The initial flood of notifications had slowed to a trickle, and I was starting to believe I could finally build a life here, disconnected from the toxicity I'd left an ocean away. I'd walk along the Spree, losing myself in the city's graffiti-covered history, feeling the weight of the last 8 years begin to lift. My phone would buzz with a message of support from a stranger, and it was like a distant echo, a reminder of the battle I'd fought, but not a battle I was still fighting. The war I thought was over. I had survived. I was wrong. The war wasn't over. My family was just reloading. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was sketching out a new interface for a client, classical music, playing softly from my speakers. My life felt normal, productive, calm. Then my phone lit up on the corner of my desk. It wasn't a notification from the public forum or a news app. It was a direct message on a social media app I rarely used, one I'd forgotten to completely lock down. I hadn't blocked everyone. You don't think to block the people you haven't spoken to in 5 years. The name on the screen was a ghost from my past, a cousin. We'll call her Jenna. We were close as kids, but drifted apart as adults, as families do. I hadn't seen her since before Haley's addiction had truly taken root. A small, naive part of my brain flickered with hope. Maybe she saw my post. Maybe she was reaching out to say she understood. Maybe she was an ally. That hope turned to ice in my veins the moment I opened the message. It was a solid wall of text typed with a fury that seemed to burn right through the screen. There was no greeting. No "how are you?" Just the unholstered rage of a loyal soldier in my parents' army. It read, "Christopher, I don't even know who you are anymore. Your mother called me sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Your father sounds like a broken man. Do you have any idea what you've done to them, to Haley?" I could feel the blood draining from my face. My apartment, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a glass cage, and my family was on the outside, tapping on the walls, their faces twisted in anger. The message continued. "To put our family's private pain on the internet for a bunch of strangers to pick apart, it's the most selfish, cruel thing I have ever seen. Haley is sick. She has end-stage renal disease. She could die. And while she's hooked up to a machine 3 times a week just to stay alive, you're halfway across the world writing sob stories for attention, for internet points. You're trying to play the victim, but you're the one holding the knife. Every word was a perfectly crafted missile designed to bypass my logic and hit every insecurity I had. The guilt, the shame, the fear that maybe, just maybe, I really was the monster they believed me to be. But after 8 years of their manipulation, I had developed an immunity. As I read, a cold, analytical part of my mind began to dissect the attack. Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say, "Christopher, the things you wrote aren't true." She didn't deny the 8 years of enabling. She didn't deny the pressure campaign or the fact that they'd called my kidney a family resource. She couldn't, because everything I wrote was the verifiable, unvarnished truth. Their only weapon wasn't to dispute the facts. It was to attack my character for revealing them. They were changing the subject from what they did to what I did. It was a classic textbook maneuver, one they had used on me my entire life. The message wasn't over. The final paragraph was not an accusation. It was a demand, an order. "You have humiliated this family in a way I can't even comprehend. People we've known our whole lives are calling your parents. They're asking questions. You've brought shame on all of us. You need to fix this. Take that disgusting post down now. And then you need to write a public apology to Haley for what you put her through. It's the least you can do after destroying her spirit like this. You owe them that." I dropped the phone on my desk like it was burning hot. I stood up and started pacing the length of my small apartment, from the window overlooking the quiet courtyard to the galley kitchen and back again. The classical music was still playing, a bizarrely serene soundtrack to the complete implosion of my fragile peace. Destroying her spirit, I thought, the anger now a hot current rising in my chest. Her spirit was being destroyed by alcohol, a process my parents had co-signed and funded for 8 years. Humiliated the family's choices had humiliated the family. I had just turned on the lights. And the demand? Oh, the demand. Take it down, apologize. It was so perfectly them. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to understand. They wanted me to surrender. Deleting that post wouldn't just be removing words from a website. It would be an act of recanting my own reality. It would be a confession and admission that their narrative was the correct one, that Haley was the blameless victim, that they were the long-suffering parents, and that I was the cold, ungrateful son who selfishly withheld a family resource. It would mean crawling back into the box they had built for me, handing them back the key, and admitting that my own health, my own life, my own future was secondary to their feelings. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I was 26 years old. I had a career I was good at, a life I was trying to build, and 2 perfectly healthy kidneys that belonged to me and me alone. Agreeing to their demand meant sacrificing all of it, not just the organ, but the autonomy. The truth. The message from my cousin wasn't just a message. It was a summons, a command to return to my designated role in the family drama. They had lost control of the story, and this was their first clumsy attempt to seize it back. They had sent in a flying monkey, a term I'd learned from the supportive comments on my post, a person they manipulate into doing their dirty work, allowing them to attack me while maintaining a veneer of plausible deniability. "Oh, we didn't tell her to say that. She was just so upset on our behalf." I could already hear my mother's voice. I felt a pang of sadness for Jenna. She was a pawn. She was being fed a heavily edited, weaponized version of the story, and in her misguided loyalty, she had picked up their banner and charged into battle for them. But that sadness was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the situation. Pawn or not, she had made her choice. She had aimed her words to hurt, and she had succeeded. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a grim clarity. My post hadn't been the end of the war. It was just the opening salvo. I had thought that by telling the truth, I could cauterize the wound and walk away. But they weren't going to let me. Their shame wasn't leading to self-reflection. It was curdling into rage. And now they were trying to use that rage to bully me back into silence. I walked back to my desk and picked up the phone. I read the message one last time. "Take that disgusting post down, now." The words stared back at me, an ultimatum from a world I was desperate to escape. For a moment, I considered just blocking her, deleting the message, pretending it never happened. I could just retreat deeper into my fortress of silence. But I knew I couldn't. Ignoring this was a form of surrender. It would tell them that their tactics worked, that if they applied enough pressure, sent enough proxies, and generated enough guilt, I would eventually break. It would mean living in fear of the next message, the next unknown, relative the next sock puppet account. My escape to Berlin wasn't just a physical act of moving. It was a declaration of independence. And independence, I was now realizing, isn't something you declare just once. It's something you have to defend over and over again. My quiet, peaceful evening was gone. The calm was shattered. The fight had followed me across the ocean and found its way into my sanctuary. I was no longer a passive observer watching the fallout from a distance. Their message meant to intimidate me into submission had done the exact opposite. It had pulled me out of my anxious waiting and forced me back onto the battlefield. They wanted me to fix the damage. They wanted me to apologize. They thought they could still give me orders. A strange sense of resolve settled over me. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't excitement. It was the cold, heavy certainty of a soldier who knows he has to walk back out onto the field. They had re-engaged. They had escalated. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that I would have to escalate right back. This wasn't just about a post anymore. This was about my life, and I was not going to let them take it back. It took less than 24 hours for their counteroffensive to begin. It was more coordinated, more polished, and infinitely more vicious than I could have imagined. They didn't just respond. They launched a campaign. It started with a post on my mother's social media page. It was a picture of Haley and me from about 10 years ago from a family vacation. We're teenagers, smiling arms slung around each other's shoulders, the picture of happy siblings. But they had cropped it, applied a soft focus filter, and turned it black and white. It looked like a memorial photo. The caption was a masterclass in manipulation. It spoke of a family's private agony being cruelly exploited for internet fame. It painted a portrait of Haley as a fragile soul bravely battling a devastating genetic illness, whose only hope was the love of her family. My name was never mentioned directly. I was only her brother, a cold and distant figure who had chosen to abandon his sister in her darkest hour. Then came the key omissions, the lies that were so much more powerful than outright fabrications. There was no mention of the 8 years of active alcoholism. No mention of the interventions, the broken promises, the chaos she sowed in our lives. There was no mention of the fact that her end-stage renal disease was a direct documented consequence of her drinking a condition called alcoholic nephropathy. And most importantly, there was absolutely no mention that Haley was not and had never been on an official transplant list. The post was designed to be shared. It was tragic, simple, and emotionally resonant. It worked. The comments started pouring in. People who had never met us, who knew nothing of the decade of dysfunction, offered their prayers and their condemnation in equal measure. My father, who rarely used social media, shared it with a simple, gut-wrenching comment. A father's heart is broken. The narrative I had fought to control was being ripped away from me, replaced by their carefully constructed fiction. The public tide began to turn. My inbox, which had been filled with messages of support, started to see a trickle of doubt, then a stream of hate. "How could you do this to your own sister?" one message read. "She's sick. What is wrong with you?" another demanded. The most chilling part was that some of them were from people I knew, distant family friends who had only ever seen the curated, happy family version of the Thomases. They escalated. They found out where I worked. My company has a public-facing contact page, and they must have shared it in private groups. I got an email from my manager in Berlin, a kind woman who had been nothing but supportive. The subject line was, "Just we need to talk." My heart sank. She explained very professionally that the company's HR department had received over a dozen emails about me. They called me heartless, unprofessional, and a family-destroying monster. They threatened boycotts. They demanded I be fired for my unethical character. My new life, my sanctuary, was being systematically invaded and poisoned from thousands of miles away. I spent an hour on a video call, my face burning with shame, explaining a deeply personal trauma to my boss, just to save the job that had been my escape route. But the final, most devastating blow came from Haley herself. She posted a video. She was sitting on a couch in our parents' living room, the lighting soft, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked smaller, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice trembling. She talked about her battle, how she was trying so hard to get better, how she was in recovery, and taking it one day at a time. She said that all she ever wanted was for her family to be whole again. Then she looked right into the lens, and it felt like she was looking straight through the screen at me. My brother. My brother's post. It broke me, she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. I thought we were a family. I thought he loved me. To see him tell the world these things, to see him turn his back on me when I need him most. I don't know how I can ever heal from that. The video was a nuclear bomb. It went viral in our extended social circle. It was the perfect emotional weapon, and my parents had aimed it right at my heart. It didn't matter that she wasn't in recovery. It didn't matter that she was still drinking. It didn't matter that the whole premise was a lie. In that moment, she was the victim, and I was the villain. The war for the narrative was lost. My truth was buried under an avalanche of curated pity. I sat in my silent apartment in Berlin, the glow of the screen illuminating my face, and I felt utterly and completely defeated. They had pushed me to the edge, and I realized with a terrifying clarity that my only way out was to jump. I had held one card back. One piece of the story I considered too private, too clinical, and perhaps too cruel to share. I had hoped I would never have to play it. But as I sat there watching my professional life crumble and my character be assassinated online, I knew they had left me no other choice. They had backed me into a corner, and they had forgotten that a cornered animal will do anything to survive. I didn't make a video. I didn't write an emotional tirade. I logged into my account, took a deep breath, and wrote the calmest, most factual post of my life. Thank you to everyone who has followed the story and offered an opinion, I began. There has been a lot of discussion about my decision, and I feel it's important to provide one final piece of context. The central issue has never been my willingness to help my sister. The issue has always been the medical reality of the situation. I then laid it out clearly and without emotion. I explained that for a patient with Haley's diagnosis, end-stage renal disease due to alcoholic nephropathy, every major hospital network in the country has a non-negotiable protocol. Before a patient can even be considered for placement on the official transplant recipient list, they must complete a minimum 6-month sobriety program with verifiable documented proof of their abstinence from alcohol. And then I delivered the final devastating truth. My sister was diagnosed 6 months ago. She has not completed this program. She is therefore medically ineligible to receive a kidney transplant from any donor living or deceased. The entire campaign by my parents to pressure me into this surgery has been for a procedure that is and remains medically impossible. I wasn't done. I knew that without proof, it was just my word against theirs. So I did the one thing that they could never argue with. I ended the post with a simple sentence. This is not my opinion. This is hospital policy. And below it, I pasted the direct link to the official public-facing transplant policy page for the hospital network where Haley was being treated. It was all there in black and white in a PDF under the hospital's official letterhead. I hit post, then I turned off my phone. The collapse was instantaneous and total. The link was an unimpeachable source, a blast of cold hard fact that vaporized their entire smoke and mirrors narrative. People who had sent me hate mail were now confronted with the undeniable truth they had been manipulated. They had been lied to. They had been used as pawns in a toxic family's emotional blackmail scheme. The public turning wasn't just a turning, it was a mauling. The comments on my mother's post and Haley's video flipped overnight. They were accused of emotional abuse, of monstrous manipulation, of attacking their son to cover up for the fact they had enabled their daughter's alcoholism for 8 years. Friends, neighbors, and family members who had offered them sympathy were now publicly demanding to know why they would lie about something so fundamental. Why would they put me through hell trying to force me to agree to a surgery that no doctor would ever perform? Within 12 hours, their entire digital world vanished. My mother's profile was deleted. My father's was gone. Haley's tearful video disappeared into the ether. They didn't fight back. They didn't explain. They simply ran. The shame was so absolute, so public, that their only option was to retreat into total silence. I wish I could say it felt like a victory, but it didn't. There was no triumph, no surge of vindication. I just felt empty. I had won, but what had I won? The right to not be harassed, the right to my own organs. I had been forced to publicly detonate my own family, to lay out my sister's most painful medical details for the world to see, just to get them to leave me alone. It was a victory that tasted like ash. A day later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Haley. There were no full sentences. It was a garbled, furious, and heartbreakingly sad jumble of words, a mix of rage at what I had done and a deep, despairing cry of pain. It was the last time I ever heard from her. It was the sound of the final, irreparable crack as the bond between us shattered forever. The next morning, I logged into my own social media account. I looked at the posts, the thousands of comments, the furious online debate that was still raging. It was a digital ghost of a family that no longer existed. This wasn't my life anymore. This was just noise. I went into my settings, and with a few clicks, I deactivated my account. The battle was over. The noise faded to silence. Weeks have passed since then. My life in Berlin has found its rhythm. The emails to my employer have stopped. The whispers and accusations are gone. My world is quiet now. It's filled with the rattle of the U-Bahn train, the chatter of new colleagues, and a language I'm slowly learning the taste of coffee from a small shop on my corner. I'm building something new brick by brick. I know what I lost. I lost a sister and parents and the entire history that came with them. There's a phantom limb quality to it some days, a sense that something is missing that will never grow back. But I also know what I gained. The victory wasn't over them. The victory was for me. I protected my body, my right to choose what happens to it. I protected my mind from their endless cycle of guilt and manipulation. I look at my reflection now, not in a dark apartment window late at night, but in the glass of a bus stop on a bright, chilly morning. I am 26 years old. I have a career. I have a future. I have 2 kidneys, and they all belong to me. I am alone, but I am at peace. I have lost my family, but I have finally completely claimed ownership of my own life. And that is a freedom that was worth any price.